This was a cashless exercise, so no monetary consideration was paid. In total, Chamath received 38.6 million shares of Clover Health. He paid $168.4 million, so his cost basis was $4.36 per share. Now that we understand the details of the SPAC transaction, we can identify two blatant lies that Chamath told in a CNBC interview. He said, quote, "There is no way I can win unless the stock goes up," unquote. This is not true. If you're a retail investor and you wanted to invest in Clover Health, you would have to purchase shares for $10. If the stock falls below $10, you lose money. Chamath effectively paid $4.36 per share. Even if Clover's stock price declined 50% to $5, he would still make a profit. As it turns out, Clover has been such a disaster of a company that the share price has fallen below $3, which is below even Chamath's cost basis. But this doesn't change the fact that his statement was false. The second lie he told was a bit more subtle, but equally important.
I want to make sure that you're not confusing fees with investment. Fees, I don't make any, right? And just to remember how a SPAC works, a SPAC is not dissimilar to many other investment products. So for example, if you take a private equity fund or a venture fund or a hedge fund, we all operate very similarly. There is a principal, we raise money from investors, we allocate that capital. Typically funds take a 2% fee every year, we do not. And all organizations typically take 20% of profits if it works.
Here, Chamath is doing his best to obfuscate the issue of the promote, the 20.7 million shares he received for free as a sponsor of the SPAC. He says he does not make any fees. He then compares his SPAC to a private equity or hedge fund. Many hedge funds have a so-called 2 and 20 fee structure. They charge a 2% management fee on their clients' assets. They also charge a performance fee of 20% of the profits each year. He compares the promote to the 20% performance fee charged by hedge funds. A performance fee is still a fee, so his statement about not charging fees is already not true. But there's an even more fundamental problem. Let's say you invest in a hedge fund. The hedge fund makes a profit of 10% this year. They charge a performance fee of 20% of the profits, so you pay a 2% fee. If the hedge fund has a bad year and loses money, you don't pay any performance fee. The performance fee is based on the profits. If there are no profits, there is no performance fee. Clover Health was a complete disaster. There were no profits. There was a massive loss. Chamath got 20% of the shares of the SPAC for free. This was not 20% of the profits because there were no profits. To his credit, the CNBC host tried to call Chamath out on his BS. Let's have a listen.
But what you just suggested was that you're getting no promote.
No, that's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that you have $16 million initially, plus $160 million on the back. Total, I've just told you what we own.
Even when the host directly calls him out about the free shares he's getting from the promote, he immediately obfuscates by talking about the amount of money he invested. He does this to muddy the waters and confuse the audience. This strategy appears to have worked. This interview was published on CNBC's YouTube channel. The comments section was flooded with Chamath fanboys, saying things such as, "I love how Chamath is so chill while the interview is trying to rail him. Good on you, Chamath. You held up well against this fool. Chamath, way to keep your cool, brother. I would have for sure snapped on this dude. Chamath is the new Buffett." Chamath knows that his retail investors have neither the expertise nor inclination to read through the regulatory filings and see that what he's saying is BS, so he can easily fool them. When Chamath took his SPACs public, he would often go onto the financial media and talk up how great these companies are and how optimistic he is about their prospects. At this point, many retail investors regarded Chamath as a shrewd investor. They were happy to invest alongside Chamath, assuming he had done his research. Take the example of Virgin Galactic. Not only did Chamath take Virgin public via SPAC, he also became the company's chairman. So he seemed to be very committed indeed. This created controversy when Chamath subsequently dumped his shares. In December of 2020, Chamath filed to sell a portion of his Virgin Galactic shares. Knowing that this would likely cause negative sentiment, he released the following tweet, quote, "I sold these shares to help manage my liquidity as I fund several new projects starting in 2021. I remain committed and excited for the future of Virgin Galactic," unquote. Shortly after this, he appeared on the All In podcast, where he again addressed his recent share sale.
To sell some shares of Virgin Galactic. I saw you tweeted about it and you wanted to be transparent. People asked for you to address it up front on the show, so go ahead.
Yeah, I have a lot of projects that I intend to fund in 2021. I'm probably going to put another, I think the forecast was almost $2 billion to work. And I needed to manage my liquidity for this year and make sure that I could continue to make all those investments and fund my fund all of the other things that I need to do, and that's why I did it.
And you're still a significant shareholder, I assume, and you believe in the company.
Yeah, I mean, I remain completely committed to that business. It would have been better if I could have sold something else, but it's not quite possible. And when you leave the tax year, you just have to make these decisions to lock in some gains against other losses. And would have loved to have not had to do it, but I needed to manage my liquidity, and so I sold. It's a small portion of what I own.
So Chamath sold a small portion of his Virgin shares to manage his liquidity and for tax harvesting purposes, but he remains completely committed to the company. It came as a huge shock when just 3 months later he dumped his entire stake in the company. On the day this was announced, Virgin's stock price declined by 10%. One thing to know about Chamath is that he has very thin skin. By 2023, it was obvious that Virgin Galactic was a failing company and its share price had collapsed. Some Virgin shareholders on Twitter became angry with Chamath for having promoted the stock. One user wrote, "You said buying Virgin Galactic stock is like owning a tech business. Their profit margin is going to be 80%. You sold. Now I am a bag holder and I lost everything." Chamath replied, "Why did you not sell when I sold? What was your underwriting at that time?" Another user asked Chamath, "How do you live with yourself given the massive losses you inflicted on SPAC holders?" Chamath replies, "I didn't inflict any losses. Stop being a victim. The world will pass you by." The same user responds, "You are a pump and dumper, nothing more." Chamath replies, "I'm in the arena trying stuff. Some will work, some won't, but I'm always learning. You're anonymous and afraid of your own shadow. Enjoy the sidelines." Chamath isn't directly responsible for his followers' investment decisions. Fair enough. But I would ask Chamath, what was your underwriting when in December of 2020 you said you were totally committed to Virgin Galactic, just to dump your entire stake 3 months later? Now let's look at Chamath's new SPAC, which he announced in September of 2025. Let's analyze the lengthy Twitter post he made about it. As you might expect, this post is full of manipulative language and self-aggrandizement. So let's dive in. He says, "When I launched my first series of SPACs, it created several important milestones. We ignited an asset class that has since been used to place more than $150 billion into private companies going public in America. Not only did this grow the total number of public companies, it funded many ambitious projects and goals and reinforced America's superiority in the global capital markets. We helped entrepreneurs and startup employees with a predictable way to go public in a timely and efficient manner that has since become commonplace." Chamath was indeed one of the biggest SPAC promoters during the pandemic-era SPAC mania. But he did not invent the SPAC, nor did he create the extraordinary set of market conditions which allowed speculative investments like SPACs to flourish. Had it not been for Chamath, the SPAC mania would likely have happened anyway. Moreover, the SPAC mania was a disaster. Yeah, companies were able to raise $150 billion, but most of these companies were unviable or even fraudulent. That's why their share price performance has been so bad. The SPAC mania was a massive misallocation of capital that cost investors tens of billions in losses. This is not something anybody should want to take credit for. Chamath continues, "All of this said, it hasn't been all roses. I have seen how the perception of SPACs became clouded, particularly related to sponsor compensation, forward guidance, and retail investors' involvement. With American Exceptionalism Acquisition Corp, I wanted to address this directly and make improvements based on what I've learned." He personally takes credit for all the supposedly good aspects of SPACs. He then says that SPACs in general have received a bad reputation due to issues around sponsor compensation and forward guidance. He words this in such a way as to avoid taking personal responsibility, as if it were other SPACs, not his, that committed these offenses. But Chamath was probably the single biggest offender in terms of misleading the public about the fee structure of his SPACs. He also gave absurd future projections about how profitable he expected his SPAC companies to be, which in almost all cases they massively underperformed. This new SPAC does have a different compensation structure compared to his previous SPACs. The founder shares, the free shares he receives as a sponsor, they don't vest immediately. They vest in tranches once the stock price reaches 50, 75, and 100% versus the initial price of $10. But even if the company ultimately is a disaster, the stock price can increase substantially in the short term based on investor hype. For a significant period of time, Virgin Galactic's stock price traded at well over double its initial SPAC price. Even under the new compensation plan, Chamath would have been able to vest his shares and dump them for a massive profit. If the stock price never increases and the shares never vest, Chamath loses nothing. He gets massive upside potential with no downside. Chamath also says he doesn't want retail investors to invest in this SPAC. This deal was built for institutional investors. Specifically, 98.7% went to large institutions, each picked explicitly by me. The remaining 1.3% was allocated to retail investors. This is what you call a red herring. Whenever any SPAC IPOs, the vast majority of the IPO proceeds come from institutional investors. After the IPO, the shares trade freely on the stock exchange. At this point, anybody can buy them. For all SPACs, the vast majority of retail investors buy in on the secondary market, usually after the merger is announced. The fact that most of the IPO proceeds came from institutional investors is largely irrelevant. If he really doesn't want retail investors to buy into his SPAC, why does he post about it on Twitter, where the vast majority of people reading his tweet are likely to be retail investors? While I can't go inside Chamath's head, I believe he's playing a psychological trick. The company his new SPAC will merge with will be so great and so sophisticated that lowly retail investors couldn't hope to understand it. Only the smart, institutional investors like himself can. Just like when you tell a kid he's not allowed to take cookies from the cookie jar, that just makes him want to eat them even more. Of course Chamath wants retail investors to buy shares of his SPAC. He wants the share price to pump so that he can vest his free founder shares. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Chamath Palihapitiya? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.
Need to run Windows on your Mac? Parallels Desktop.
Remember this masterpiece on piracy in the 2000s? So this was a commercial made during a time when everyone was pirating songs and movies. But thanks to the golden age of streaming the decade after, piracy actually went quiet while we were happily binging Breaking Bad.
You got me.
But during the same time, something else was happening where we're starting to see the effects of it today. Around the same time in the 2000s, private equity firms quietly started buying up your favorite studios just like they're doing today with housing in all those now bankrupt companies. But why should you care? Well, fast forward to today, and the average American pays $1,300 per year for streaming services just to still see ads. And because of this, people are boarding the pirate ship again. But oh yeah, private equity is also now starting to expand to sports teams and now even your favorite YouTubers. But what if I told you that piracy is now one of the only ways people can fight back against private equity during a time when you can't find jobs, afford housing, and you're paying Chipotle in 4 different installments? I think what other videos get wrong about this topic is that this goes way beyond having to pay more for Netflix. Because if culture is truly America's biggest export, private equity is about to take it all for themselves. And if piracy doesn't win this fight, we might lose the last thing that Americans can actually agree on.
Piracy is a result of bad service.
30 to 40% of all internet traffic is piracy.
Even if piracy is illegal, it is an act of rebellion so important that doing it is your moral and civil duty.
So to understand piracy's comeback, we first have to start with how private equity secretly started buying up the entertainment industry without any of us really knowing. Because it's important context for you to understand by the end of the video on why everything we watch nowadays sucks, well, except my videos of course, and why this battle between piracy and private equity goes beyond entertainment. So for decades, small sets of executives and CEOs controlled Hollywood and took all the profits. And now that's still true, it's just they don't really work for themselves anymore. Because almost every aspect of entertainment has sold out to private equity. Take the studio behind this intro. Yeah, there's a reason why we don't see that lion anymore. So MGM Studios owned James Bond, Rocky, massive franchises, but in the 2000s, they started flopping. MGM was drowning in debt and looking for a way out. And so people started circling around MGM. And in 2005, Sony and several private equity firms bought MGM for $5 billion using a leveraged buyout. Like I explained in my previous videos on how private equity is buying up homes and companies, they use this leveraged buyout to make that deal happen. So they put in around $1 to $2 billion in cash, and the rest, the $3 billion, was funded through debt. Which of course that debt is loaded onto the company that they acquire, so MGM now held even more debt when they started. After being bought out, 15% of staff were laid off, divisions were folded, all to squeeze short-term savings and make the math on paper look better. But even after cutting costs, MGM was still saddled with debt, and the movies that they were putting out were flopping, so they filed for bankruptcy just 5 years later in 2010. Since then, MGM has been passed around like a blunt from one private equity firm to another, each extracting value until in 2022, Amazon finally swallowed it all up. I'll get more into that later, but what's important to take away from this is that this MGM deal in 2005 kicked off a gold rush. And soon after, movie theaters like AMC and Cinemark went to private equity, Nielsen, the TV ratings company, to Blackstone and KKR, DreamWorks, Miramax, and even talent agencies like WME, all bought by private equity. And just like MGM, all these companies were gutted by cutting creative staff, which boosted stock prices short term. And the playbook was laid out where private equity firms saw just how much short-term profits that they can make from advisory and management fees, but especially from flipping the studio's media library. Similar to the mortgages in 2008, these libraries could be chopped up and financialized, licensed and resold to streamers like Netflix. But later on, as they saw with MGM, and once fees and value has been fully extracted and squeezed out, years later, a lot of them were also resold or even bankrupted like MGM, and these studios, banks, and bond investors took a hit on that debt. So the private equity firms that play their cards right profited a lot, but what it fundamentally changed was the profit incentive in Hollywood, which stopped becoming about actually making good movies to make more money, and instead the incentive became all about short-term profits. So if all this was happening during the late 2000s and 2010s, how the hell have none of us heard that Hollywood was literally being bought out? We're literally talking about an industry where paparazzi report on the littlest, dumbest things that a celebrity does? Well, because Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, Rolling Stones, and IndieWire are all owned by Penske Media Corporation. And guess who backs PMC? Private equity. So the very outlets that should have been reporting on this buyout spree were all owned by the same financial interests. But now, as you can imagine with the cracks showing, over the last 5 to 7 years, these sorts of investments into Hollywood has dried up. And you know, there's other reasons such as rising interest rates and the reality that streaming platforms don't really make that much money. But one of the biggest reasons was the return of piracy by consumers. And that's where we're really starting to see this battle today of piracy and private equity. And the one that adapts the fastest will win. But believe it or not, for creators like me, it's a similar battle. That's why I use my sponsor, Opus Clip. And they've grown way beyond clipping. Now it's one of the most powerful AI growth tools for creators. And with automated workflows, my long videos get pulled in, auto-edited into clips, and soon even scheduled to post while offline. The new editor is faster than ever with fresh caption styles, and their upgraded Reframe Anything is basically autopilot. 2024, 25% of people today admitted to piracy.
My business is thriving. So when I heard that ClickUp is the AI work platform that grows successful companies, I said we don't need it.
Let's get this out of the way early. There are a lot of reasons why a game studio might close. Sometimes studios simply run out of money before their game can be finished. Development costs are too high, a recession eating into capital, or just mishandling money. But that's not what we want to focus on today. What we want to look at is studios owned by some of the richest corporations in the world who get shut down despite having more than enough money to keep them up and running. I'm talking about EA, Sony, Microsoft, companies that are too big to fail who have amassed huge numbers of smaller studios under their umbrellas. Almost every week, it seems like one of these companies is announcing another wave of layoffs or shutting down another beloved indie studio. For a long time, EA was the worst offender. During their rise to power, they made a name for themselves by buying up smaller studios. An independent studio would find success on the market, like Visceral Games with the Dead Space series, or Pandemic Studios with Star Wars Battlefront. They'd buy out the studio for a couple million, milk them for a couple games, and if their sales numbers ever started to dip, EA would simply close them down. Now, this was of course EA's fault. The company was notorious for pushing strict deadlines, stapling revenue goals to the top of every meeting sheet, and gently suggesting gameplay tweaks like microtransactions that would make the game more profitable. Oh, and if you didn't include them, you were fired. When their sales numbers inevitably tanked, they'd blame the studio for messing it all up and then shut off the lights. Here's a list of all the studios EA has acquired and then shut down over the years. But there's a second layer to why EA bought these studios in the first place, and why shutting them down really isn't a big deal for them. When a big company purchases a studio, the people are secondary. What really matters is the IP they created. For example, although Pandemic Games was closed in 2009, the Star Wars Battlefront series they created was rebooted in 2015 and made EA hundreds of millions of dollars. Similarly, although Maxis was officially closed in 2015, The Sims 4 and SimCity are still up and running, and The Sims IP continues to print money. A large corporation doesn't just buy the studio for the people, they buy them for their ideas. Westwood Studios, the team behind the legendary Command & Conquer series, is a perfect example. They were one of the biggest names in gaming in the 90s and were purchased by EA in 1998. After putting out a few rock-solid games, EA decided the RTS genre wasn't doing it for them, and decided to shut the studio down. However, they retained the Command & Conquer IP and continued putting out CNC games via EA Los Angeles throughout the 2000s. When that well eventually dried up, EA put together a new studio called Victory Games in 2010 to try and put out a free-to-play Command & Conquer game. But that project was such a complete and utter failure that the studio shut down a year later, making Command & Conquer the only game on this list to shut down 2 separate studios. Now, the importance of owning an IP as a publisher is pretty apparent. Even if the studio gets shut down, you can continue milking the franchise into oblivion. Bungie and Halo is a good example of this. Bungie was purchased by Microsoft in 2000, and part of the deal was that Microsoft would keep the Halo IP. When Bungie left Microsoft in 2010, Microsoft was able to keep Halo, transferring the game to 343 Industries, and they've been pumping out mediocre Halo games, toys, and TV shows for the past 15 years. Another example came in 2014, when Microsoft acquired Mojang, the creator of Minecraft, for $2.5 billion. At first, people were shocked. Why would Microsoft spend so much money to buy it? But Microsoft saw more than just a game. They saw an opportunity to build an empire. It wasn't just a computer game, it was brand recognition. Microsoft saw an opportunity to use Minecraft in ways Mojang never dreamed of, creating spin-off games like Minecraft Dungeons and Minecraft Story Mode, creating a Hollywood blockbuster that now sits as one of the highest-grossing films of the decade. Microsoft saw the potential of the Minecraft IP and turned it into a multimedia empire. And this taught the industry an important lesson. Control an IP and you're able to control the market. The more IPs you have, and the bigger they are, the larger your market share. It's why EA bought half the industry in the 2000s. It's why Tencent owns Riot Games and invested heavily in Epic, and it's why Microsoft has spent the last 5 years and nearly $100 billion acquiring the likes of Bethesda and Activision Blizzard. Control is the name of the game. And here's where things get kind of weird. On one side of the coin, owning a bunch of studios can earn your company a lot of money, especially if those studios are making hits. But on the other side of the coin, owning these studios also denies your competitors the chance to make any money off of them. When you buy a studio, you're not just earning this piece of the pie for yourself, you're making sure your opponents can't take a bite of it. Sometimes it's more important to starve your competitor than it is to feed yourself, an idea which has made companies like Microsoft do some really weird things in recent years, such as buying game studios with the sole intention of shutting them down. It sounds outlandish, but stay with me for a second. Picture this. You own an art museum. It's a small museum that specializes in Renaissance art and attracts people from all over. Business is going well, but in an effort to attract more visitors, you're always looking out for beautiful pieces to add to your collection. Unfortunately, there's another, bigger museum down the street. They specialize in Baroque art. So while you're not looking to buy the exact same paintings, you're still technically competitors. Well, this big museum realizes that if they buy up all the Renaissance art that comes up on the market, they can prevent you from getting them and growing your museum. Eventually, as inflation continues to go up, your museum will be unable to keep up and you'll be forced to close. But here's the messed up part. That other museum doesn't put the paintings they buy on display. They don't even hold them in storage. They just take the paintings out back and burn them, throw them in a pile, pour some gasoline on, and watch it go up in smoke. If they destroy every Renaissance painting that comes up on the market, they can slowly choke you out until they're the only museum in town. This is what Microsoft has been doing over the past few years with game studios. An independent studio will show promise, they'll buy them out for a couple $1 million, and then, after they release a game, they'll shut them down. On the surface, it looks ridiculous, but apparently it's purely strategic. They don't sell the studios because that would be giving talented individuals to their competitors, so they force them to disband so no other company can come in and scoop up the pieces. In this late-stage capitalistic hellscape we find ourselves in, the goal of every company is to reach monopoly. And it's just as important to weaken your opponents as it is to make yourself strong. The moment that showed just how ruthless Microsoft is in this regard came in 2024, when they announced a wave of layoffs and studio shutdowns that had everyone scratching their heads. When Microsoft acquired ZeniMax in 2020, they incorporated Bethesda and a slew of other companies into the MS fold. One of those studios was Arcane, responsible for the game Redfall. This game was a total flop, so no one was really surprised when they announced in May 2024 that they were shutting down the studio responsible for it. However, in that same announcement, Microsoft announced they were shutting down another studio, Tango Gameworks. This announcement came as an utter shock to everyone. Tango Gameworks was the team behind Hi-Fi Rush, widely regarded as one of the best rhythm games in recent memory. It was, by all accounts, a resounding success both critically and commercially, recording more than 3 million players and earning multiple awards for sound and music. So when Microsoft announced they were shutting the studio down, people were outraged. One of the things Microsoft had been vocal about in recent years